third of the Senate Judiciary Committee that we've held since the Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade, eliminating a woman's constitutional right to reproductive freedom. It was almost 2 years ago the court issued its decision in Dobbs versus Jackson. With a single ruling, the right-wing majority overruled nearly 5 decades of legal precedent and revoked a constitutional right for the first time in history. In the years leading up to Dobbs, we were warned about the dangers of overruling Roe versus Wade. Medical experts told us it would unleash a healthcare crisis across America. Legal experts warned us that it would establish a disastrous precedent under which unelected judges can recklessly eliminate fundamental freedoms. And women across the country warned that overruling Roe would insert politicians and judges into the most personal decision imaginable, taking away their right to choose whether and how to expand their family. At the outset, I want to share a video on the state of our reproductive health care system in the post-Dobbs era.
And the Supreme Court has overturned Roe v. Wade, that they have eliminated the constitutional right to an abortion.
I got rid of Roe v. Wade.
Is it worse than you imagined?
It's worse faster.
Since Roe v. Wade was overturned 19 months ago, 21 states have established full or partial abortion bans.
After stabilizing just enough to deliver our stillborn daughter, my vitals crashed again. In the middle of the night, I was rapidly transferred to the ICU, where I would stay for 3 days as medical professionals battled to save my life. What I needed was an abortion, a standard medical procedure.
The drug mifepristone has been available to women for more than 20 years, used in more than half of all abortions in the U.S.
As we sit here today, procedurally, everything's on hold, but this is a case that is moving very quickly, and we can all expect the Supreme Court to issue an opinion.
My husband and I have been trying to expand our family for the last 3 years.
Many of these people left in agonizing limbo, blindsided after the Alabama Supreme Court shocked the country, ruling that frozen embryos created during IVF are considered children.
It was really crushing. Pregnancies are complicated, and it's difficult sometimes to build your family, so it's really terrifying when that's left up to politicians and judges.
Contraceptives,
Total ban.
the fallout,
Legal challenges. These anti-abortion laws.
Trigger laws.
legal confusion.
To ban abortion nationwide.
The fallout of the Dobbs decision has been devastating. Women with non-viable, life-threatening pregnancies have been denied access to medical care, as we heard from Amanda Zarowski under oath at our last hearing. Amanda's testimony is seared in my memory. Forced to continue a non-viable pregnancy due to Texas's extreme anti-abortion law, Amanda developed sepsis and nearly died. Amanda's health care providers wanted to provide the abortion she needed, but we now live in a nation where health care providers live in fear of civil and criminal liability for simply doing their jobs. A nation where women suffering from miscarriages have been threatened with jail time, and where access to FDA-approved medication used safely and effectively for more than 2 decades is threatened. In a nation in which just last month, a state Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos are children under a state law, which resulted in numerous IVF clinics in the state halting their services. For those who desperately want a baby but struggle with infertility, for cancer patients who must safeguard future reproductive options as they undergo treatment, for LGBTQ couples who use IVF to expand their families, this ruling in Alabama was heartbreaking. Today, we will hear from Jamie Hurd, one Alabaman affected by this decision. Despite state lawmakers' slapdash efforts to address the fallout after the Alabama Supreme Court decision, there remain significant concerns about the future of IVF in that state and others. Fetal personhood bills have been introduced in at least a dozen other states, and 125 U.S. House Republicans have co-sponsored fetal personhood legislation with no carve-out to protect access to IVF or birth control. And Justice Thomas showed us that constitutional right to birth control is at risk when, in his concurring opinion in Dobbs, he called for the court to reconsider its holding in Griswold versus Connecticut. More than 25 million women of reproductive age now live in the states where abortion is banned, unavailable, or restricted, and women's lives are in jeopardy. Women facing non-viable pregnancies are being denied emergency life-saving medical treatment. Women suffering from miscarriages are being denied access to medication and procedures that can reduce emotional trauma and save their lives. Rape and incest survivors are being victimized by a system that makes it harder for them to end an unwanted pregnancy. Healthcare providers can no longer be able to use their best medical judgment to treat patients. And those who desperately want to become pregnant but need IVF are facing unnecessary barriers to parenthood. Those of us who believe in a woman's right to bodily autonomy need to step up and stop this chaos. We must respect women's rights to make their own reproductive health decisions. But the question remains, will our Republican colleagues join us in this effort and support legal access to abortion and reproductive freedom? With that, I turn to Ranking Member Graham for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much. So we're having a hearing today about IVF treatments, and the opening statement was about abortion. I think everybody on our side supports the idea of families being able to access this treatment. I know Senator Baldwin, staff members on our side have had families through this procedure. Absolutely committed to making sure this is available. The Alabama decision, I think, has been corrected by the Alabama legislature. There are a lot of questions around embryos and what status they should have, but I don't think you have any disagreement here on the committee that IVF treatments should be made available. I think there should be reasonable regulation in this area, just like any other area of medicine. The abortion debate is one worth having, really. I think it's very important. What kind of country do we want to be in 2024 and 2025 and beyond? I have been vocal about a national limitation, exceptions for rape, incest, life of the mother, exceptions at 15 weeks. 15 weeks limitation puts us in line with the majority of the European nations. I think 47 to 52 nations in Europe limit abortion between 12 and 15 weeks. The bottom line here is that you and others on your side have been supporting national laws that would override every state pro-life law on the books to replace it with rules that would not be Roe v. Wade. There would be absolutely no limitations at all on the ability to get an abortion. Everybody in the media says Democrats are not for abortion on demand up to the moment of birth. Well, okay, what limitations do you have? I challenge every member of this committee on the Democratic side, pick a week in the birthing process where you would limit abortion. Just any week. I don't care if it's the last week. Just pick one. You won't, because you can't. Politically, all the energy on your side is to make America like China and North Korea and Iran when it comes to abortion, where you can have abortion literally right up to the moment of birth with no exceptions at all. Most Americans reject that way of thinking. What states do after the Dobbs decision on abortion is up to them to a point. I always thought the pro-life movement to me was about the developing child. At 15 weeks, we know an unborn child can feel pain. You provide anesthesia to treat the child medically because they can feel pain. That's normal medical practices. So the debate about when to intervene, if at all, on behalf of the unborn child is worthy of a great nation. There is no effort by anybody I know of in the Republican Party in Washington, D.C. to shut down fertility clinics. Quite the opposite. We appreciate this as a form, a way of bringing life into the world for couples that are having a very difficult time conceiving a child otherwise. So we will continue to have this debate, but I'm waiting to hear from one national Democrat in the Senate, let's just start with the Senate, that would tell the country at what point would you limit abortion on demand. Just pick a week. Pick any exception at all. And the answer is deafening. Not one of you has come out that I know of with any limitation on abortion at all, anytime, anywhere, for any reason. So I am waiting to hear what you have to say. I have been clear about what I think, and I look forward to this discussion, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator Graham. We'll begin with our witnesses. When we go to the witness panel, which is the second group, each member will have 5 minutes to provide their statement and then 5 minutes of questioning from each senator. But first, we begin with a statement from my colleague, Senator Tammy Duckworth, my fellow senator from Illinois. She is an exceptional champion for reproductive rights and the people of Illinois, and I'm grateful for her joining us today. Tammy brings a unique perspective to this. I remember when she called me and said she had news to tell me, and I said, "What's up, Tammy?" She said, "I'm going to have a baby." I couldn't believe it. After what that body of yours has been through, that you were able to do that was a remarkable, almost a miracle. Beautiful little girl, and another one following. It's a tribute to you and your determination and courage throughout your life. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Graham. I am Tammy Duckworth, not Tammy Baldwin, although I am honored to be mistaken for the chairwoman of the Tammy Caucus in the Senate, Senator Baldwin. Thank you for holding today's important hearing. As a senator whose dream of becoming a mother was made possible through the miracle that is IVF, I am uniquely situated to remind this committee of a basic principle. We can recognize the value of potential human life, acknowledge that fertilized eggs are incredibly precious and valuable, and we can also accept the fact that an embryo is not yet a human being. No one, and I mean no one, better understands the hopes and dreams that viable embryos represent than an IVF patient struggling with infertility. No one better understands the pure, unmitigated joy that flows when a successful transfer of embryos results in pregnancy. And sadly, for us women who have lived through the soul-crushing, bone-deep agony of having that hope destroyed after completing unsuccessful rounds of IVF or of suffering a miscarriage, we experience in the most painful manner possible the fundamental reality that while every fertilized egg is unbelievably precious, unfortunately, not all will become a living, breathing child whose laughter and joy will fill our hearts and enrich our lives. Federal law wisely reflects this fact by defining the terms person, human being, child, and individual to only include, and I quote, every infant member of the species Homo sapiens who is born alive at any stage of development, end quote. Section 8 of Title I of the United States Code is consistent with Ranking Member Graham's common sense observation that, and I quote, nobody's ever been born in a freezer, end quote. Attempting to deny this reality, attempting to rewrite state constitutions and laws to define a fertilized egg as a human child, which is what the embryonic personhood crusade achieved in Alabama, is an affront to the millions of aspiring parents who struggle to conceive. It's a threat to the special separation of church and state. It's a betrayal of our great American spirit that reveres scientific discovery and progress. Those seeking to ban IVF won't stop at one medical procedure. Their ultimate mission is to extinguish the legacy of American ingenuity that was born in the experiments of Benjamin Franklin and continued through the groundbreaking IVF conception and birth of Elizabeth Carr in December of 1981. Look, every American has the right to personally believe that an embryo is a human child and to live their life in accordance with such beliefs by refusing to receive, provide, or offer IVF services, just as every American should have the right to decide whether, when, and how to build their family. But Congress must draw a line against a personhood movement's abuse of government power to force every American to live their life in accordance with that movement's moral beliefs. Opponents of IVF are being dishonest in claiming that the Alabama Supreme Court never banned IVF. Defining the cluster of cells that comprise an embryo to be a human being, and even the single cell that is fertilized prior to it becoming an embryo, they're defining that as an extrauterine child entitled to all the legal rights and protections of a person. This may not be an explicit IVF ban, but make no sense. As we witness in Alabama, it's an awfully effective way to ban IVF. After all, Alabama's criminal code defines murder as intentionally causing the death of a person. And just like that, 1 + 1 = 2. When Alabama defined a fertilized egg to be a person and their code defines murder as intentionally causing the death of a person, the intentional disposal of an embryo, even a non-viable one that could cause a miscarriage if you were to implant it, which is a common practice in IVF, that disposal became a Class A felony. The flawed solution to Alabama Republicans crafted to restore IVF validates this fact by branding women and doctors that receive or provide IVF as de facto criminals in need of broad criminal and civil immunity simply because they require medical help to start a family. So let me say again, the law that was passed in Alabama does not negate the fact that the destruction of an embryo is the destruction of a human being. All that law that was recently signed into law says is that we're just not going to prosecute you. The chaos, confusion, and outrage in Alabama was a chilling preview of the dystopian future that awaits us if Congress fails to pass IVF protections that are effective and enforceable. That is why any senator that claims to support nationwide IVF protections should join me and the 48 senators co-sponsoring my bill in voting to pass the Access to Family Building Act. Our pro-family, pro-freedom bill would establish a nationwide right for patients to receive IVF. It would allow insurers to cover IVF, and it would also allow doctors to provide IVF in accordance with, and I make it clear that we state this in the bill, widely accepted and evidence-based medical standards of care. Unfortunately, there's a bad faith effort to confuse the public about my bill, using absurd hypotheticals that are an insult to families struggling with infertility. So let's be clear, under S 3612, no healthcare provider would be forced to provide IVF, period. That's because my bill's statutory definition of healthcare provider excludes providers that do not provide or seek to provide IVF. In addition, my bill only intends to protect IVF services provided in accordance with widely accepted and evidence-based medical standards of care. Wild-eyed hypotheticals like creating gene-edited designer babies, and I can't believe I have to say this, but it was brought up by my colleague who stood up to oppose my move for unanimous consent to pass the bill. She said that my bill would actually allow for the creation of human-animal chimeras, such as half-human, half-horse hybrids. Neither are widely accepted or consistent with evidence-based medical standards of care for IVF. Thus, S 3612 would not protect such procedures. Bottom line, Congress has the power to prevent what happened to those families in Alabama from ever happening again. So let's come together and achieve that goal. Let's pass the Access to Family Building Act to enshrine in federal law the right to receive, provide, and cover IVF so that more families like mine can hold their precious babies after all those long years of struggle of infertility and finally have that child that they've dreamt of for decades. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Senator Graham, would you like to introduce your guest?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. And also, I'd like to put into the record Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith's response to the bill in question, if that's okay.
Without objection.
Okay. So, Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach, did I get that right? Good. Welcome. Represents Minnesota's 7th District, which covers the western half of Minnesota. She joined the U.S. House in 2021 and serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, Rules Committee, Budget Committee, and Ethics Committee. In addition to her 4 committees, she serves as a co-chair of the Pro-Life Caucus. She introduced legislation that was passed in the House supporting pregnant women, Parenting Families Act in January. During her 22 years in the Minnesota State Senate, including 4 as the first woman Senate President, Representative Fischbach led multiple legislative initiatives to protect mothers and their unborn children. She wrote the state's Women's Right to Know law and carried a number of other pro-life bills, including abortion clinic licensings to passage. She continues to fight for the pro-life cause. In Minnesota's 49th District, she received a BA in Political Science from St. Cloud State University and a JD from William Mitchell College of Law. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Senator, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. You know, I have been representing Western Minnesota in Congress since 2021, and I represented them on the state level. But I am also pro-life and have been part of the pro-life community, helping women choose life for my entire life. Senators, most Americans agree that there should be limitations on abortion. According to the 2023 Harvard-Harris national poll, 73% of American voters oppose abortion after the 15th week, meaning most Americans agree there should be limitations on abortions. The Republican position is not extreme. The position of many elected Democrats, however, is extreme. Every Democrat on this committee voted for the Women's Health Protection Act, which would allow abortion on demand through all 9 months of pregnancy. Only 10% of voters support this position. The fact is that Democrats are catering to the voices of the extreme fringe and are not listening to the American people. Republicans care deeply about the unborn child and the mother. We are looking at every opportunity to empower women to choose life and introducing legislation to support that aim. For example, this Congress, I introduced the HOPE Act. This bill arms women with knowledge and helps them access the resources they need to confidently carry their pregnancy to term and provides resources for any expectant mother to support them throughout and after their pregnancy and their children. I also introduced legislation to ensure that TANF dollars could continue to go to pregnancy care centers. This bill passed the House, but Democrats fought against it. And it became clear they fought so hard because the only option they want women to have is abortion. The display was repugnant and frankly belittling to women everywhere. Democrats can spin their stories and confuse the issues all they want. They can trust to mislead Americans into thinking that Dobbs has anything to do with IVF or the Alabama Supreme Court decision. They can try to pretend like Republicans are launching an assault on reproductive rights. But they hide behind false narratives like this to drive their political agenda and to conceal deeply troubling features of their pro-abortion agenda. We do not have to look any further than some of the bills being discussed here today, such as S-701 and S-3612. These bills would allow abortion on demand until birth. They permit things like human cloning and very problematic forms of genetic engineering. These bills also preempt all state laws and completely destroy anyone's religious right not to participate in abortions or other practices they find to be morally objectionable. These measures are extreme. They put us in the same camp as countries like North Korea and China. Senators, I understand the majority here today is looking to paint Republicans as monsters who want to take freedoms away from women in this country. I assure you, nothing is further from the truth. My Republican colleagues and those in the pro-life community agree with most Americans, and we deeply understand the challenges expectant mothers face. We stand with them and are doing everything we can to empower these women to confidently choose life for their children. And I thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
Our first panel will please approach the witness table. We welcome Jamie Hurd, who is from Alabama. Was told she had to put her IVF treatment on pause after the recent Alabama Supreme Court ruling. We are joined by Lourdes Rivera, president of Pregnancy Justice, an advocacy organization focusing on the rights of pregnant people. Our final majority witness is Dr. Austin Dennard, who has joined us from Texas. She is here to speak about her personal experience of being denied health care she needed. She's an OB/GYN in Dallas. Ranking Member Graham, would you like to introduce your two minority witnesses?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have Dr. Monique I'm going to call her Monique Wubbenhorst. Sorry, I'll get your name right in a minute. She's a board-certified OB/GYN with over 20 years of experience in patient care, teaching, research, health policy, public health, global health, bioethics. She graduated from Mount Holyoke College and received her medical degree from Brown University. She earned her master's degree in public health from Harvard. She completed her residency in OBGYN at Yale New Haven Hospital and her postdoctoral fellowship in health services research at Shep Center for Health Services Research at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She was a faculty member at Duke University School of Medicine from 2003 to 2018. She served as Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Global Health at the United States Agency for International Development. Her clinical career is focused on caring for women in underserved and disadvantaged populations, especially African American and Native American communities, with a focus on women with medical, social, and psychiatric problems. Currently, she is a senior fellow at the Center for Ethics and Culture, University of Notre Dame. Next, Professor Carter Sneed is a Charles E. Rice Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame Law School, the Director of Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame, and a concurrent Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He's one of the world's leading experts on public bioethics, and his research explores issues relating to neuroethics, enhancement, human embryo research, assisted reproduction, abortion, and end-of-life decision-making. He is author of What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics, and has written more than 70 journal articles, books, chapters, and essays. Prior to Notre Dame, he served as general counsel to President George W. Bush's Council on Bioethics under Dr. Leo Koss, where he was the primary drafter of the 2004 report, Reproduction and Responsibility, the Regulation of New Biotechnologies. In 2008, Ms. Sneed was appointed by the Director General of UNESCO to a 4-year term on the International Bioethics Committee, received a JD from George Washington University, and Bachelor of Arts from St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland.
Thank you, Senator Graham. I'd ask the witnesses to please stand to be sworn in. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witness is answered in the affirmative. And our first witness is Ms. Hurd. Could you proceed with your opening statement, please?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Jamie Hurd, and I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. I'm here to share how the Alabama Supreme Court's decision to declare personhood for frozen embryos has affected me and my family. In 2012, I was diagnosed with polycystic ovary syndrome, the most common cause of female infertility. I can remember my body feeling heavy as I listened to the doctor explain the challenges I would face in getting pregnant. Untimely news that not only changed a planned trajectory for my hopes of building a family of my own, but news that found me on the wrong side of time as we dealt with the loss of both my mother and my husband's father to cancer, and subsequently the death of my only sibling. Our family sorrow became the cornerstone of our inspiration to build and expand our family. As my husband and I began the journey to grow our family, we were met with obstacles as the doctor had previously prepared me for. We discussed options for having kids, but at the time it seemed very far-fetched because we couldn't afford the out-of-pocket costs of the medical treatment the doctor said we needed. But then, to our great surprise and luck, my employer expanded its health insurance to include fertility treatments, including in vitro fertilization. My heart was filled with so much joy and hope to finally have a chance to grow our family. This coverage was the answer to our prayers and the only way we would have access to the necessary medical care to treat my infertility. We continued to encounter many obstacles and heartaches as we went through fertility treatments, from failed attempts at conception to the devastating loss of an ectopic pregnancy. After taking a pause on further treatments for a while due to the emotional and physical distress, we ultimately made the decision to begin the journey again. We met with our doctor, who explained that after trying other medical treatments that did not work, our best chances would be with IVF. We began with months of intensive tests and procedures. And while the journey through infertility treatments was not an easy one, we were finally blessed with our beautiful son through IVF. After taking our son on his first Disney trip, a true magical experience, we felt so inspired and ready to grow our family. We decided to start the IVF journey again to have our second child. We began the process on February the 14th, 2024, when we met with our fertility doctor to put a plan together to begin that process, which again involves multiple tests and procedures. Just a few days later, we saw in the news the Alabama Supreme Court ruling classifying frozen embryos as children. We later saw a statement from our clinic that they made the decision to pause new IVF treatments due to the legal risks to their clinic and their embryologists. Our hopes broke hearing the news of our clinic pausing treatments. My heart breaks as I hear and read comments such as our health conditions are nature's way of telling us we shouldn't have kids. I've never been actively involved in politics or advocacy before. I'm truly an ordinary individual living an ordinary life. Even to appear before you today with the support of my husband and very dear friend has brought its own separate challenges. Although I'm typically not on the front lines advocating for any particular cause or issue, I knew I needed to fight not only for my rights as a woman, but also fight for my future family and all those individuals who are too deep in emotional and physical trauma of infertility. Now my husband and I are filled with so much uncertainty about how we move forward with expanding our family without the risk of being prosecuted. All these questions, all these decisions regarding my body and my family being decided by those that aren't here with me to fight the anguish of infertility. IVF is hope for those of us struggling to conceive. IVF is medically necessary care due to my and many other people's circumstances. Access to medical treatments without restrictions is a basic human right. It is enough of a traumatic experience dealing with infertility and going through fertility treatments to now have a basic human right being politicized to further expand that trauma. I'm asking you to truly put families first, which begins with having the fundamental right to build a family and the access to the needed resources to do so. You play a vital role in fostering compassion, understanding, and support for those in your communities, your neighbors who are confronting the hardships of infertility. Daily, I look and just stare at my son, still in awe that I've been afforded the opportunity to be a mom to such a beautiful miracle, a dream that for a while I did not think would come true, but it did through IVF. And I asked the committee to think about the hope that IVF means for patients like me, protect that hope, do not restrict it, but instead nurture that hope. Thank you again for letting me share my story.
Well, you shouldn't have been nervous or stressed. You did just fine. Thank you so much for being here. Professor Sneed.
Senator Chairman Durbin, Senator Graham, and thank you for inviting me to testify before you all today. When the Supreme Court decided in Dobbs that the Constitution does not preclude the people from governing themselves on the fraught question of abortion, it brought us into alignment with most nations around the world who have always addressed the issue through the political process, most of whom restrict purely elective abortion between 10 and 14 weeks of pregnancy. After nearly 50 years of being deprived of the authority to meaningfully govern ourselves in this domain, the current political and legal landscape is widely varied, complicated, and a work in progress. But our system of federalism allows for divergent approaches to vexed questions. Some states have enacted strict limits on abortion, whereas others have dramatically increased access. Voters have supported abortion rights in every state referendum since Dobbs, going so far in Montana as to reject a proposed law protecting newborns who survive abortions. A similar proposal was rejected by this body. I would like to respectfully make 3 suggestions for good governance in this difficult area. First, it's important to be clear about the complexity of the issue. It is not simply a variation of the healthcare debate, or even reducible to the important values of equality or bodily autonomy of women facing serious burdens on their health and future. Rather, the issue challenges us to consider how these goods stand in relation to the life of the unborn child, a whole, living, distinct member of the human species who, if all goes well, will move herself along a trajectory of development from embryo to fetus to newborn, provided she has the necessary support and sustenance in her mother's womb, the first place of belonging for every human being. She is not a trespassing stranger. She is the biological child of this particular mother. Our public debate is impoverished when those who support abortion rights fail to acknowledge, much less respond to this reality. On the other hand, our discourse suffers when pro-life elected officials fail to acknowledge and seek to alleviate the sometimes crushing burdens of unwanted pregnancy and parenthood. To govern ourselves wisely, justly, and humanely, we must begin by articulating the problem before us in its full complexity without question begging. Second, we must fairly and accurately characterize the legal landscape. Here, too, we've fallen short. A recent Alabama case has been widely misdescribed as a theocratic power grab heralding the demise of IVF. In fact, the victorious plaintiffs there were IVF patients suing a clinic for the negligent destruction of their frozen embryos using a civil statute that already allowed such claims for the death of embryos in the womb. The decision did not depend on and had nothing to do with Dobbs. In response, the conservative legislature and governor moved immediately to grant blanket civil and criminal immunity to IVF clinics for such misconduct. Popular accounts of women in Texas being denied life-saving medical care are similarly lacking. Texas abortion law allows exceptions to protect a mother's life or prevent her substantial bodily impairment. But many of these cases involve women seeking abortions because their unborn child was the one to receive a heartbreaking and tragic diagnosis of disability or terminal illness. But Texas law does not authorize abortions solely because of an unborn baby's disability or poor prognosis. Regarding risks to mothers, Texas just passed a bipartisan law stating that previable premature rupture of membranes and reaffirming that ectopic pregnancies fall under the health exception. The same goes for miscarriage management. The Texas Supreme Court just declared that serious health risks need not be imminent to justify abortion. And the reasonable medical judgment standard for clinicians invoking such exceptions has been in place without issue since the passage of Texas's 20-week abortion ban in 2013. Since then, there have been 238 abortions performed at or after 20 weeks, and there have been 0 prosecutions in the state of Texas. This week, the Texas Medical Board will meet to develop clinical guidelines in this area. Finally, I would invite members to reimagine the framing of the human context in which the question of abortion arises. Instead of a zero-sum conflict among strangers over the permissible use of lethal force, think of it instead as a crisis facing a mother and her child. Then ask how we can work together across our differences to come to their aid, not just during pregnancy, but throughout life's journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Dr. Lourdes, or Miss Lourdes Rivera.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and Senate Judiciary Committee members for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Lourdes Rivera, President of Pregnancy Justice, a nonpartisan legal advocacy organization that for over 20 years has defended and advocated for the rights of pregnant people facing criminalization and other rights violations. I want to first explain what is pregnancy criminalization and fetal personhood, and then discuss the path to Alabama's IVF decision. Pregnancy criminalization is charging pregnant women for conduct that would not be illegal except for the fact that they are pregnant and regardless of pregnancy outcomes. This includes being charged with murder for experiencing a stillbirth or for having a miscarriage and not knowing what to do with the fetal remains, as if there were an instruction manual for that. We've documented over 1,800 cases of pregnancy criminalization in the years 1973 to 2022, from Roe to Dobbs. The majority, 1,400 of them, occurred in the last 15 years as fetal personhood gained traction in state law. Unsurprisingly, those targeted are overwhelmingly poor and disproportionately people of color. Bestowing legal personhood status on fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses is what underlies these prosecutions, as well as abortion bans and threatens IVF, and birth control. Attempts to define fetuses and legal persons have been rejected by voters in nearly every state in which it has been put on the ballot, including in Mississippi. Yet state legislatures in at least 11 states have passed broad fetal personhood laws before Dobbs. These laws could potentially be read to extend full rights to fertilized eggs. Constitutional protections provided by Roe v. Wade, however, meant that fetal personhood laws could not be fully enforced. But there are significant exceptions. 10 years ago, the Alabama Supreme Court held that embryos and fetuses are the same as children under the state's criminal child abuse laws, and that pregnant women can be charged as child abusers from the moment of fertilization. With over 600 women being charged, Alabama leads every state in the nation on pregnancy criminalization. And while shocking, it is hardly surprising that the Alabama Supreme Court decided to extend its reasoning to frozen embryos. Alabama, along with Oklahoma and South Carolina, whose Supreme Courts have also designated fetuses as children under their state criminal laws, accounts for 2/3 of arrests of pregnant people nationally, including those who experience miscarriage and stillbirth. When conduct during pregnancy or pregnancy outcomes are punished, pregnant people and their families suffer irreparable harm. This includes dire consequences, health consequences, incarceration, and families torn apart. Our nation is facing a maternal and infant health crisis, and pregnant and postpartum people, but especially Black women, face increased risks of death and severe complications, including due to mental health conditions. The 3 states with the highest prevalence of pregnancy criminalization also have some of the highest rates of maternal mortality in the nation. Alabama ranks 4th and has some of the worst infant health outcomes. Research shows that criminalizing pregnancy does absolutely nothing to improve maternal and infant health, and in fact, it does the opposite. Every major medical and public health association in the nation opposes criminalizing pregnancy because it interferes with the patient-provider relationship and deters access to needed health care. Let me be clear, when anti-abortion lawmakers endow fertilized eggs with personhood rights, they seek to ban abortion and IVF and threaten contraception. As legal personhood advances, more pregnant people can face criminal charges for any conceivable risk to their pregnancies or to a fertilized egg before implantation. This is not hyperbole. Our clients are living this reality now. When an anti-abortion movement talks about fetal and embryonic personhood, it is not about protecting babies. It is about controlling and punishing women, pregnant people, and communities that are already marginalized. And the Life at Conception Act, if ever adopted, would ban abortion nationally, eliminate the right to IVF, endanger access to birth control, and expand the government's ability to police pregnant people and criminalize pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes. With these attacks and the crisis we are facing, we must remember that women and pregnant people must be treated as fully autonomous, rights-bearing persons who are entitled to health care and bodily integrity, and who must be allowed to make their own health care decisions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rivera. Dr. Monique Wubbenhorst. I hope I was close in pronunciation.
It's phonetic. Thank you. That was good. That was great. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at this hearing. It is an honor to be here. Following the Dobbs decision, which returned decision-making regarding abortion to the people of the United States and their elected representatives, there have been many opportunities to mitigate abortion's harm to women, their children, their communities, and these laws protect women and children. Abortion is not health care. It not only poses risks to the mother, it is always lethal to an unborn child. These opportunities have resulted in vigorous debate on abortion and the humanity of the embryo, the unborn child. At the heart of this debate is whether or not the unborn child is a human being, which science clearly demonstrates. An unborn child is therefore not a part of the mother's body in the way that her heart or her pancreas are. Since embryos are human, they have fundamental human rights. One of these rights is the right to life. Yet unborn children are subject to abortion, even though they are the smallest, weakest, and most vulnerable members of the human family. Abortion is associated with harms to women. It is also not safer than childbirth. This false claim can be traced to papers published in leading OBGYN journals, which contain methodological errors and did not consider the biology of fetal and uterine development. When induced abortion is compared in context to childbirth, it is clear that it is not safer than childbirth. In addition, in the United States, African-American women have the highest rates of abortion and the highest maternal mortality. Both cannot be true if abortion decreases maternal mortality. Reproductive rights, so-called, are not human rights because they disappear, that is, they dispose of the fetus. So-called reproductive justice is, in fact, reproductive injustice because it selectively destroys Black and brown babies, who are 100% of the future of our ethnic groups. The same eugenic mindset that led to the sterilization of African American, Native American, and Hispanic women continues in the disproportionate rates of abortion in Black and Hispanic women. The issue of the humanity of the unborn child is also a topic of debate related to in vitro fertilization. And as noted, in 2022, 3 couples filed a wrongful death suit in Alabama regarding their frozen embryos. And the Alabama Supreme Court issued an opinion which has set up a national debate about in vitro fertilization. This ruling correctly assigns value to the embryo, but it does not prohibit IVF. It speaks only to whether embryos should be destroyed. A 2019 study found that the majority of IVF practitioners dispose of embryos by placing them directly in a trash can. They often administer alcohol or other things to try to kill the embryos before disposing of them. Louisiana and Germany have established ethics and safety standards for IVF that prevent embryo destruction. Since 1986, in Louisiana, for example, IVF and protection of embryos has occurred side by side, as embryos are recognized as human beings, not chattel property. In Germany, since 1990, the Embryo Protection Act has regulated how embryos may be handled. In procedures, the number of embryos, fertilized ova that develop into embryos may not exceed that number of those that are transferred to the woman during a treatment. No more than 3 embryos may be stored. Sex selection is prohibited, and embryonic research is prohibited. Embryo destruction can be addressed in part by reducing the creation of excess embryos. It is not IVF that is at issue, but rather whether embryos should be destroyed. People can be in favor of IVF without agreeing with the destruction of embryos. The IVF industry has been described as the wild, wild west. These questions show the dilemmas associated with it and the need for its regulation. Anyone who knows, who has family member who has cared for, who has undergone IVF can testify to its mental, emotional, and financial costs and burdens. Prospective parents embrace these to build their families. But are all aspects of the IVF process compassionate and just? There is a need to regulate the industry, protect children, protect mothers, and maintain parents' legal rights. In addition, when we look at fetuses with anomalies, how do we treat them with dignity? The developmental accident that resulted in disability does not make these children subhuman. The value of a child's life has nothing to do with how long it is or how he or she was conceived. How we treat mothers matters too. Multiple studies indicate that there is a psychological benefit to continuing a pregnancy following prenatal diagnosis of a lethal fetal defect, especially where there's compassionate palliative care for newborns with anomalies. The rights of a mother and those of her unborn child with an abnormality or with unexpected or, quote, unwanted, close quotes, are not in opposition, they are intertwined. Both have inherent human dignity. Both deserve not only compassion and justice, but love, because love seeks the highest and best for another. Both deserve the best of care, which excludes abortions because abortion is not health care. It violates the bodily integrity, autonomy, and rights of the mother and kills her unborn child. To conclude, the Dobbs decision has resulted in vigorous, even fractious debate about abortion, but debate is positive. A similar debate should ensue for IVF with the view to better regulation. The IVF industry is concerned with the deepest desires of parents and with the most vulnerable human beings, unborn children. Our views of human dignity, along with compassion, justice, and scientific and clinical data, should inform this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Austin Dennard.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, thank you for having me here today. My name's Austin Dennard. I'm a mother, a Texan, and a practicing OBGYN. I'm here today to describe what life has been like in Texas since the federal right to abortion was taken away by the Supreme Court and the state began criminalizing and banning abortion care. Nothing brings me more joy than being a mother to my 3 children, but a close second is being an OBGYN. I get to be present for the most incredible moments. There's nothing quite like a moment when a baby is born and a family is created. I've delivered thousands of babies and it still takes my breath away. But intertwined in these celebrations are also moments of complete heartbreak, pregnancy loss, devastating diagnosis, infertility. Since SB 8 was enacted and Dobbs' decision came down in 2022, those tough moments have become even more tragic. In Texas, where my husband and I both practice medicine, we live in fear as physicians and as patients. I can speak to both of these perspectives because I am a Texan and an OBGYN who needed an abortion in Texas and could not get one. After careful consideration and many prayers, my husband and I were delighted to find out that we were pregnant again in the summer of 2022. Between our 2 toddlers and growing surgical practices, we were feeling really busy, but also very blessed. But at 11 weeks of pregnancy, I had a routine ultrasound that changed the course of my family's life forever. The brain and skull had not formed. It was anencephaly, the most severe neural tube defect, 100% fatal. I will never forget looking up at that ultrasound screen in complete disbelief and devastation. I needed an abortion, but would have to flee my state to get one. Texas, where I've lived for 6 generations, where I practice medicine and where I'm raising my family. My mind began to spin. Where would I go? Who would take care of me? Who will take care of my children? What about my patients? And what if this is the last time I ever get to be pregnant? Because of Texas's new laws, we were afraid to use credit cards or even tell people why we were traveling to the East Coast so suddenly. I was terrified my husband would be arrested for aiding and abetting my abortion just for traveling with me. And under Texas's new laws, the penalties were so severe, 100 years in prison, huge fines, a loss of our medical license. It was humiliating. Through it all, I felt so broken and abandoned by my home state. But at the same time, I had never seen my luck and privilege with more clarity. What would other people do in my place who could not afford the extensive costs and lost wages? No one should have to be lucky to access essential medical care. As heartbreaking and traumatizing as that was for me, it is even more disturbing to be a working OBGYN in Texas, trying to abide by these paralyzing and punitive laws while still providing timely, compassionate, and ethical care for my patients. Conversations in my office are different now. Couples arrive for their pregnancy confirmation visits filled with worry. They know how much is at stake. What if it's an ectopic? What if I start bleeding? What if I become really, really sick? I have the same answer for all of them, that I will do everything in my power to keep them safe. But still, we collectively hold our breath as we pass the pregnancy milestones, because my patients know that lawmakers have stripped away their rights to make decisions about their own health, their own body, and their own family. So long as they remain on Texas soil, their pregnancies belong to the state. Exceptions are said to exist in the laws, but in reality, it's fiction. These bans have stolen so much from us. I have spent the greater part of my life dedicated to becoming the best doctor I know how to be, yet lawmakers are making decisions about my body and my practice as if they know better. I've never wanted to be a public person, but I can't be silent anymore. The silence is too painful. These cruel laws have to change. Texas women deserve better. Americans deserve better. And my 4-year-old daughter deserves so much better. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll have 5-minute rounds of questions. I'm trying to resolve in my mind these 2 issues of abortion and IVF. I understand the premise. If you start with the premise that life begins at conception, then it certainly is reasonable, I suppose, to follow that through to the conclusion that no abortion is warranted and to want to overturn Roe versus Wade, which is what one group of thinkers in this country arrived at. But then for the same people to say, well, I'm all right with IVF, seems to me to be inconsistent, because we know during the IVF procedure, we run the risk, if not the reality, that there will be embryos created that will not be implanted. So is this the end of a life? How can you reconcile those 2 positions? I find it difficult, very difficult. Professor Sneed said we're going through a work in progress since Dobbs. It sure is a work in progress when you hear Dr. Dennard and others, Ms. Hurd, describe what they've been through. But it's a work in progress that I think is fundamentally ignoring the obvious. Ms. Rivera, this notion of personhood, how would you describe it?
Thank you for your question, Senator. I think you're absolutely right. These reproductive health issues do not exist in silos. And the problem is that if you define fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses as legal persons with independent rights, it's going to affect everyone. It's going to affect abortion, it's going to affect access to IVF, it's going to affect contraception, and it's going to affect the quality of health care that pregnant women and pregnant people are entitled to. So you're absolutely right.
So they wanted to overturn Roe versus Wade to take away the right of a woman to decide to end her pregnancy. Now there are some who want to outlaw IVF and deny a woman the right to start a pregnancy. The common notion here is the woman is just a vessel, is not a participant in this decision-making process, either for her own health or the future of her own family. Dr. Dennard, is that what you discovered?
Thank you so much for bringing this up. When I was pregnant in my state, I felt exactly how you describe. I felt like a vessel. And when I looked up at that ultrasound screen and saw that I was growing a pregnancy that had no skull or brain, but had no way of making any decision on my health, it's exactly how I felt. And that's exactly how my patients feel when they are in similar situations. We've lost our ability to make any decisions about our bodies, and it's harming women, and it's harming families.
There was a report on National Public Radio just yesterday that, quote, said the dangerous disruption of standard of care of pregnancy in the state of Louisiana in wake of the Louisiana abortion ban. The story noted that women in that state have been forced to undergo a cesarean section when their water breaks early in pregnancy, before the fetus is viable, instead of receiving an abortion procedure or a medication, which is standard medical practice. One doctor explained the C-section was done to, quote, preserve the appearance of not doing an abortion. And even more galling, the patients aren't even given a choice. As I understand it, a C-section is much more serious and not a safe procedure as ordinary vaginal abortion. Equally troubling, the NPR story reports that OBGYNs in Louisiana are now delaying routine prenatal care until patients reach 12 weeks, a serious deviation from standard medical practice. Can you speak to how these restrictive abortion bans affect the ability of OBGYNs to practice a standard of care that you learned in medical school?
Thank you for this question. At this point in my state, I feel like Ken Paxton himself is standing in each and every one of my office rooms when I see patients, because now individuals are having to change the way that they practice medicine. Individuals are having to change the way that they counsel patients due to all of the fear that has paralyzed our care. So much so that women who are living in Texas and other states where abortion bans exist, their lives are at stake, and they are not receiving the same medical care that individuals are in states where the restrictions are not so severe. There are so many rippling effects of this. There have been migration of physicians to different states. Patients have been abandoned in certain states because of this, and we're losing physicians that have the ability to do procedures, including abortion care, because of these restrictions.
Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sneed, you mentioned something in your testimony that most nations, Western nations, limit abortion from 10 to 14 weeks. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I think 47 of 52 European Union nations have a limitation below 15 weeks. Is that correct?
That is my understanding, Senator.
Why is that?
Well, one major difference between European nations is that they have resolved these questions through the political process, in which they have come up with laws that balance, in the judgment of the people, in an appropriate way, the important goods of autonomy and health and equality for women on the one side, but also respecting the intrinsic equal value of every human being from conception.
Right. My point is elected officials do this.
Absolutely. We are unique in that we are one of the only countries that I'm aware of in which for 50 years the Supreme Court set our national abortion policy as opposed to the people themselves.
Now, after the Dobbs decision, elected officials at every state level decide matters of when you can have abortion limits, if any. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that's in line with most of the civilized world in terms of having elected officials do this.
In most cases, it's decided by the people through their elected officials. Yes, Senator.
So let's talk a little bit about IVF treatment. The Dr. Can I call you Monique? Great. And say Monique. You mentioned Germany. They have laws regulating IVF treatments. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
Is that true of most Western nations?
I'm not as familiar with the overall landscape.
What about Mr. Sneed, the most?
Yes, it is the case. And the country that pioneered IVF, the United Kingdom, has an elaborate scheme of regulation of IVF and embryo research.
And we don't.
We are unique in that way. We do not have an overarching scheme.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the embryo. In Germany, there are limits on how many embryos you can create. Is that correct, Monique?
That's correct.
All right. I guess the reason for that is this ethical debate we have. What is an embryo? Is it a person? I don't know of anybody who's been born that wasn't at one time an embryo. We all have that in common. To kind of deal with what we're talking about. Is that right, Mr. Sneed?
Yes, that's correct, Senator.
Okay. So I'm very open-minded about this in this regard. I want every family to be able to have a child, and if science can help, that's great. IVF treatments have been a blessing to many families. The idea of what legal protection to provide when, I think, should be done by elected officials. So I'd like to get us kind of in line with the rest of the world on this area, if that's even possible. We have tax credits for children. I think everybody up here is for tax credits for children. Should we have a tax credit for people trying to have a child through the IVF process, because it's very expensive? Maybe we should. The point I'm trying to make is that all of us are for life. There's just a different opinion of when the law should intervene. Some people say you have no rights until you're actually born. Other people believe that the day before you're born, you should have some rights. It's all a balancing act here, right? And what I'm trying to do, Mr. Chairman, is if we don't have any national standards about IVF treatment, should we? Monique, what do you think?
I think that it's very important to open the debate and to have national standards. As I've said, even people related to the industry say that it's like the Wild West.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Sneed?
Yes, Senator. There's a statute that you all passed in 1992, your colleague, Senator Wyden, called the Fertility Clinic Success Rate and Certification Act, which began as a sort of consumer protection law, but it's proven to be inadequate to even protect the interests of families that are seeking IVF. And I think it would be a great opportunity, as the President's Council on Bioethics recommended, to take up the question to see how moms and babies and families can be best protected who are seeking fertility care.
So I'd like to sit down with you and anybody else to try to find out a way to see if we can get America united on this topic. Creating life is a good thing. IVF is a good thing. Like every other practice, it needs to be regulated. What happens when the clinic negligently destroys an embryo that is yours, part of you? These are decisions that we need to talk about. And, Mr. Chairman, I'm hopeful that over the arc of time, maybe we can find a way to create an environment in this country where we support IVF, not only just through regulation, make sure it's ethical, make sure it's done right, but maybe we should encourage people to use this process through tax credits. Somebody's got to pay my Social Security. The more children, the better.
Senator Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for having such a timely hearing. Thank you all for being witnesses here today to help us all learn and understand the varied perspectives across a really rich issue environment. Mr. Sneed, there was an exchange between you and Senator Graham about the state of IVF in other countries around the world, where you talked about the sort of regulatory framework that other countries around the world have relative to IVF, and as well as like the gestational periods and correct me if I'm getting any of your testimony incorrect. Can you speak to the state of paid medical family leave or paid medical leave in those countries as well?
It's an excellent question, Senator. And I think in many of those countries, there's more support for people who have families. And I've argued in print and elsewhere that if a person wants to be comprehensively pro-life, that has to be part of the picture. You have to provide a safety net and support for moms and babies and families.
Totally appreciate you raising that point, because my next question is going to be about the state of childcare in those countries. And we can go down the list. All of those countries also have a higher minimum wage than $7.25. All of those countries also allow workers to unionize without intimidation from their employer. All of those countries also provide comprehensive health care and retirement security for the residents in those countries. Am I characterizing that accurately?
It's obviously a complicated question because we're talking about a lot of countries, but I think that there are many instances in which they do better than we do in those respects. Yes, ma'am.
I appreciate you helping me to bring this into perspective and really try to understand the juxtaposition and the tension that we find ourselves in, this sort of uniqueness in spaces. I think that's the word you use, the sort of U.S. Uniqueness, as there are many other ways in which the U.S. Is unique, in ways that it is not advancing the equivalent supports for families for life as those other countries that are being compared to. There's an interesting other sort of irony that I wanted to sort of call forth in the sort of pro-life argument as it's being presented here, and that is the irony of that argument sort of juxtaposed with the criminalization of patients and physicians. I find it ironic, and I direct this to you, Dr. Dennard and Ms. Rivera, find it ironic that the folks who are doing their best by way of presenting as patients in need of a healthcare procedure, a full spectrum of healthcare procedures that women often need that are different than men, that the punishment is a criminal record, years in prison, and losing your livelihood to provide for the family that is a demonstration of this value of life. Can you talk, you spoke a little bit, Dr. Dennard, about the trends that you're seeing in the OBGYN space in Texas. I wonder if you could offer just quickly a little bit more of what you are seeing. What are OBGYNs talking about? Are there more medical school students, for example, that are choosing to, on match day, practice in the OBGYN space?
Thank you so much for bringing this up, and you speak so eloquently. You take the words out of my mouth, really, when it comes to the irony that we're all facing. We are seeing that states like Texas are less desirable for medical students that are coming out of their training because the training is different now in our state due to these ridiculous regulations, to be quite honest. And when I went to medical school, I went because I wanted to take care of people. I didn't think I was going to have to worry about being criminalized or being thrown in jail. I just want to take good care of my patients. They're like family. I see patients who come to me in college wanting to talk about contraception, and then the next year they come back, they've met someone, they're getting married, they want to talk about starting a family, and then we go through pregnancy together. And it's a really, really important relationship that we have with our patients, but it's becoming really traumatizing.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chair, if I might just close, I do look forward to working with my colleagues to make sure that we repeal the Trump tax cuts for the wealthy so that we could actually do some of the things that other countries are doing to wrap around the kind of full service of life and protection of life that other countries around the world are doing. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Butler. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rivera, if you were queen for a day and you had unfettered discretion to establish a national rule on abortion for America, what restrictions, if any, would you implement with respect to abortion?
Thank you for your question, Senator. I would, so the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists opposed restrictions that are not based in medicine, right? People need to be able to make their own reproductive health care decisions, and having arbitrary restrictions lead to the situations like we've been hearing about, like Kate Cox and others who are not able to get the health care they need during obstetric emergencies. We know the majority of people access abortion
but
services
maybe I wasn't
early.
clear, because I've got to ask each of our witnesses here. Just tell me, if you could implement any rule, what restrictions, if any, you would put on abortion.
Senator, arbitrary restrictions put women's health in danger.
So that means no restrictions?
Senator, healthcare needs to be driven by medical practice and medical standards of care.
You don't believe in any restrictions on abortion?
Healthcare needs to be driven by medical standards of care.
Well, your website says you support abortions at all gestations. So
that is correct, because
you support abortion
needs
without
to be made
any
available
restrictions
based on medical standards of care.
How about, could you get it, if the mother's healthy and the baby's healthy, would you support an abortion the day before birth?
Actually, that is not how abortion care works,
Yes, ma'am, but would you
Senator.
support that? You say no restrictions.
That is called labor and delivery, Senator.
But you support no restrictions.
That is not how abortion care works, and it's
Sure
really,
it does.
that is not how
my
abortion
question's
care
simple.
works, Senator.
Would you have a rule saying that if a healthy mother with a healthy baby wanted to have an abortion the day before birth, would it be okay with you?
Senator, that is not how abortion care works, and it's really dangerous. That rhetoric is really dangerous for the people who are
It
confronting
would be
these
okay with you, wouldn't it?
That is called labor and delivery, sir.
It would be okay with
That
you,
is called
wouldn't it?
labor and delivery, sir.
I find that astonishing.
Senator,
I noticed
that is really
on your
offensive.
website,
That is really offensive
you
to
issued
the
a
people
press
needing
release.
to
You
access
don't
abortion
refer to
care.
mothers. You say at your organization, you don't refer to mothers. You call them birthing people. Is that right?
That is among the language that we use,
Yeah,
yes.
what's the difference?
A birthing person is someone who's in labor and delivery.
Okay, that's a mother, right?
So for sure, the majority of people who are pregnant are cisgender women, and at the same time, we have to acknowledge that trans people and non-binary people do and can become pregnant, and it's really important not to misgender them in law and health because it is really dangerous to them.
You were invited here by my Democratic colleagues today?
That is correct.
Okay. Dr. Dennard, if you were queen for a day, what restrictions, if any, would you place on abortion?
Well, if I was queen for a day, I would use shared decision-making between myself and my patients so I could take really, really good care of them.
So you don't think there ought to be any restrictions?
You know, that's not really how abortion care works. We need to be able
Yes, ma'am,
to
but I'm
take
trying
care.
to understand your position first. Do you support any restrictions on abortion?
I support my patients, I trust women, and I know that they're going to make the right decision for themselves.
Okay. And you were invited here today by the Democrats?
Correct.
Okay. Professor Sneed. Well, let me back up. I don't have much time left. How would you change Texas law? Are you suggesting that Texas should adopt a law that's saying there should be no restrictions on abortion?
Are you asking me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. If I could change Texas's laws, I would be able to take care of my patients if they're in need without restriction.
I just find it extraordinary that neither you nor Ms. Rivera are willing to say what you believe, which is clearly that you don't think there ought to be any restrictions on abortion. You think it's okay. You want society to adopt a rule that says if a healthy mother with a healthy child wants to have an abortion, maybe she wants a different gender the day before birth, that's okay.
Senator,
and you both seem, it's clear that's what you believe. Why won't you say it?
with all due respect, I've been to medical school. I've done multiple years of training, delivered babies, and done thousands of surgeries for over a decade. And you're describing a clinical situation that just doesn't exist, Senator.
No, ma'am, you're wrong. You're wrong, and you know I'm wrong. Do you perform abortions, doctor?
I am not an abortion provider.
Okay. Have you ever done an abortion?
I have never done an abortion, but I take care of my patients who are actively having miscarriages.
Okay. I think I'm over. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
On the Republican side. Senator Ossoff. Wait a minute. Is it Ossoff? Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Welch, if you are in a big hurry. Okay.
Looks like my chairmanship's in doubt. Proceed.
Dr. Dennard, thank you for joining us and sharing your story with us. I want to talk about the availability of OB care, particularly in parts of the country with extraordinarily high rates of maternal mortality and shortages of qualified obstetric clinicians. In the state of Georgia, just for context, half of our counties have no OBGYN at all. We have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country. And I hear consistently in rural communities, and in fact, just a few days ago on a defense installation in Georgia, speaking with service members and military spouses, just how dire this lack of access to obstetric care is. And of course, it's not just OBGYNs, it's obstetric nurses, it's midwives, with sometimes deadly consequences for women who are unable to access health care, perinatal health care. Georgia has passed one of the most extreme abortion bans in the country at 6 weeks before many women even know they're pregnant. One of the things that I'm hearing is that the fear of criminal prosecution of doctors deters OBGYN residents from pursuing training in states with those kinds of extreme abortion bans. And I think as the clinicians here probably know from their experience, my understanding is that doctors are much more likely to stay in practice where they've trained. The question for you is, based upon your experience as a doctor, what's the impact on local communities when there are no OBGYNs or the nearest qualified provider is 90-minute drive away?
Thank you for highlighting this really important issue. Personally, I practice in a large metropolitan area in Texas, but what I can say is that many medical journals will show it's no surprise that when there's lack of access to care, there are very poor outcomes. And patients have to travel. They have to travel now to get the care that they need, and that distance is becoming further and further for them. So what happens is the areas that have lack of access to care, patients travel and overwhelm other areas where there is more access to care, and there are bad outcomes. So it's quite devastating to the women in our country, and it's negatively affecting my specialty significantly.
Thank you, Dr. Dennard. Ms. Hurd, I've heard, my office has heard in the last few weeks from a huge number of Georgians who are scared that the direction my state is on, the direction the country is on, could deny Georgia families access to IVF. We saw what happened in Alabama. We see more and more extreme policies. A 6-week ban, for example, far out of the mainstream, opposed by most Georgians, deterring OBGYNs from practicing in the state. We see more and more of this being pushed across the country since the Dobbs decision. And so families are afraid that they may not have access to IVF. They may not, therefore, have the opportunity to achieve the blessing and responsibilities of parenthood. What is your message for families in Georgia and across the country who feel fear right now that their path to conception and parenthood may be closed to them by political extremists?
Thank you, Senator, for asking that question. I think I mentioned in my testimony that I've never advocated for anything before. Me being here today is completely new territory for me. But when everything kind of took place in Alabama, I felt attacked. I felt like my family was being attacked, my future family was being attacked. And I know so many other women personally that are going through the process that, unfortunately haven't had success as of yet. But I knew that I needed to step up and let my voice be heard, not just for me and my experience, but also for all those others that don't have the ability to let their voice be heard, to fight for our rights and to continue to have access to those treatments that we need. So my message to them is, I understand that infertility is such a personal trauma and it's hard to talk about, it's hard to speak about, but I empower them to get active, let your voice be heard, let your story be shared, because the more that we speak up, the more that we share our story, the more that we can bring awareness and understanding to what the IVF process is, the better, hopefully that we can see change through that.
Thank you for your courage. Thank you all.
Senator Tillis.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Ms. Hurd, I know this is a unique experience for you, but thank you for being here. I'm sorry about the challenges you went through. And Dr. Dennard, did you not speak before a judiciary hearing in the past?
I did.
I thought so. I remember your testimony. I think you were sitting at the far left in that hearing, if I recall. I'm Tom Tillis, senator from North Carolina. I was Speaker of the House before I came up here to the Senate. And I remember when I decided to run for the Senate, I had been Speaker, and we'd passed some pro-life bills. They were termed at the time radical pro-life bills. In North Carolina, they said, now that you're running for Speaker or Senator against a Democrat pro-choice incumbent, how are you going to deal with your record? I said, you're asking the question as if I'm going to run from my record. I intend to run on my record. And Ms. Hurd and Ms. Dennard both, I'm very sorry for the experiences that you went through, but this hearing isn't about coming up with a common sense solution or maybe striking balance that I heard in Professor Sneed's comments. This is about it's about political points. So I'm sorry that you have to be a part of this, but if you'll indulge me, I won't go over my time. But the reality is, the reason I wasn't concerned with my radical position on pro-life is because I was consistent with the majority of North Carolinians. It was even better numbers probably back at the time. We're not talking about, we get into this argument, we shout over everyone because we talk about the extreme position as if I would have supported the extreme, what I argue was an extreme judgment in Alabama, but the fact of the matter is Mr. Sneed did a pretty good job of explaining how that whole process went into place. And then the Alabama legislature fixed that one. Having said that, I, for one, think that policies that the Alabama legislature proposed on abortion restrictions are a bit extreme. And ultimately, over time, I don't think that they will win the day in terms of public opinion. Maybe the same could be argued for some of Texas's policies, although they've addressed some of the concerns that may have made the experience that you went through go differently. But when people go out of this committee and they hear the narrative of the Republicans' extreme policies, vast majority of the Republicans' extreme policies are in alignment with the Western world. They would be out of alignment with countries like China and North Korea, but they're not extreme. It's not extreme to say late trimester abortions have to have some reasonable limits, including exceptions that would not have been an impediment to Dr. Dennard's abortion. I think that there's a happy middle ground that most Americans will accept, but they don't get a chance to have that discussion because what we have here are policy-driven hearings that really drowned out those in the middle who think that there probably is a common sense middle ground. I think this is pretty close to it. Maybe we could have a debate about it. Let me tell you what's not mainstream policy. A vote that we had on the floor that every member who was in Congress, a Democrat member, voted for, and every member in this Congress has co-sponsored, a Democrat member. It's a pretty extreme policy. And this is, I told my staff, you better fact check this 3 ways to Wednesday because it is factually what was voted on the floor. And I had somebody call into my office saying, Senator Tillis, you have to support that vote on the floor because it's just codifying Roe v. Wade. He did not know who I was. But I had staff, I told my staff, if you get calls like this, tell them that the Democrats are voting on a policy that would use taxpayer dollars to compel a religious institution to perform an abortion on a minor, not necessarily with a doctor, a physician's assistants, without the knowledge and consent of their parents. That is not hyperbole. That is not exaggeration. That is the text of the bill that my colleagues voted on, and then they come to a hearing like this and suggest that we have the radical position. This is rejected by a vast majority of the American people. So if we want to have a hearing educating people on radical, that is radical. That is a law that was voted on the floor and is now co-sponsored by my Democrat colleagues. So I look forward, as somebody who's worked on a lot of bipartisan bills, I look forward to having an honest discussion where Ms. Hurd's experience can be taken into account, Ms. Dennard's experience can be taken into account, and the extremes at either end, which are preventing any sort of certainty that I think every expectant mother deserves or any aspiring mother deserves, you are collateral damage for the political games that we play here in these committee hearings, and this is an example of one that has nothing to do with a reasonable bipartisan outcome. Thank you all for being here.
Sorry, Chris. First of all, thank you all for being here. I know these are very difficult issues and very often very personal issues. In my meetings with the OBGYN community in Rhode Island, the doctors are horrified and furious at what they're hearing from their colleagues in other states who have to make the awful decision to not provide the standard of care that they are trained to because a bunch of characters in the state legislature wrote over what medical science knows to be best practices, and that's particularly concerning when a pregnancy begins to be troubled, and now you've got the mother's health at risk as well. I am very, very sorry for your experience, Dr. Dennard, and I'm really grateful that you took the trouble to come here and share it. Chairman Durbin opened up with the observation that if you come to this with the belief that life begins at conception, not only is taking away women's rights to make a choice about abortion something you want to get rid of, but IVF has to go too, because it necessarily involves embryos. It's hard to have one theory apply in one case but not in the other. I'm a little bit concerned that that also would apply to mifepristone, a perfectly legal drug that is sold by regular pharmacies and can often be delivered through the mail. You're a doctor who practices in this area. Do you see the drug mifepristone as being in the crosshairs of this theory that life begins at the moment of conception?
Thank you so much, Senator Whitehouse. Mifepristone has been so regulated and it's so difficult to obtain in the state of Texas that I really don't have personal experience administering it or prescribing it for patients. I think it's really important.
You presumably don't take it until a pregnancy has commenced, until there is an embryo, right?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
It presumably is prescribed once there is an embryo.
Correct.
Yeah. So it would seem that mifepristone is next in the crosshairs of things to be taken away. And I don't know if contraception is next. That used to be an issue in this battle. Maybe that's where we go next. It just doesn't seem to make any sense any longer in this context of fetal personhood. I just really hope that, to follow Senator Tillis's remarks, that as we go through this, we can bear in mind just what evil this has worked in the medical profession when hard family choices have to be made with the life and safety of the mother at risk, the life and safety of the fetus at risk, and a doctor doing their very best, using the very best standard of care that they've been trained to all their professional lives, trying to advise through that very, very difficult and painful situation. And the notion that some force from the state legislature is suddenly in that room with that family and trying to give directions to the doctor and to the mom about all of this. I mean, talk about having the person who is least likely to make the right decision in that place. So God bless you for what you've done, and thank you for being here today.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it. And I'm going to pick up kind of where Senator Tillis left off, because this hearing today is really a distraction from the discussion that we ought to be having. And as he said, what my colleagues across the dais have supported, the Women's Health Protection Act, is really something that goes so far beyond codifying Roe v. Wade. It goes so far. It is that bill that is abortion on demand from conception to birth. That's what that bill does. Partial birth abortions, it permits. It even goes so far as to supersede state laws, federal and state laws that are conscience laws, and that protect healthcare providers who choose not to perform abortions for moral or religious reasons. And the policies that the Democrats have laid out hardly get covered by the mainstream media. But I can guarantee you that media will cover this hearing today because they want to say Republicans are anti-IVF. And we know that's probably what they're going to say. Now, and we know they'll use fear tactics and try to falsely paint Republicans as anti-IVF so that they can scare families. Well, just for the record, and here's the reality, I support IVF. I support fertility-related services. I'm a mom and a grandmom, have plenty of friends that have used IVF in these services. I think that having children is one of the greatest blessings that God gives us. I want Tennesseans to have the right to rear that family. And I will always oppose efforts that are going to block IVF, because it is a service that many people need. So I think it is long past time that we hold our colleagues, our friends across the aisle, to account for what the Women's Health Protection Act would actually do and the radical nature of that. And Dr. Wubbenhorst, thank you for being here today. I spoke a little bit about that Women's Health Protection Act and how far it goes beyond codifying Roe v. Wade. And one of the most reprehensible provisions that is in that legislation is the ban on informed consent. And the fact that those requirements are banned, you couldn't give the woman the opportunity to view the image of an unborn child or to hear the heartbeat of an unborn child. I am the sponsor of the Women's Right to Know Act. I think women need that opportunity to experience what that life in the womb is really about, and to know that. And I would just like for you to weigh in the minute I've got left about what women have a right to know about that, about the dangers that are there with abortion, the medical complications. So I'd like for you to speak.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I do think that the ability to see your baby's heartbeat and hear it is extremely important. And I think one of the reasons for the opposition is that there are some studies that show that about at least 60% of women who actually do that will choose to keep their baby and parent their baby. So that shows the power of what you see and what you hear as overcoming the idea that, okay, this is just a clump of cells, this is not really a human being. I think that the other points that you're making are very important about the safety of abortion. Abortion is associated with significant harms to women. And I do want to correct something. You know, it's not true that abortions do not occur very, very late. Dr. Warren Hearn does abortions very far into the third trimester. And that is not the same as labor and delivery, because the goal of labor and delivery is a living child. The goal of an abortion is a dead child. And in fact, if an abortion is not successful, that is called a failed abortion. So those two things are not equivalent. In addition to that, both medical and surgical abortion are associated with complications, and women deserve to know what those are. They need to understand that these procedures and have important consequences for them, including hemorrhage, infection, damage to the uterus. I've personally cared for women who had abortion complications, in particular needing an ICU stay, needing a couple of surgeries after their mid-trimester abortion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and thank you to all of our witnesses and my colleagues. The Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health 2 years ago overturned roughly 50 years of settled precedent and was a forceful, a brazen act of conservative judicial activism. As we've heard today from a number of my colleagues and several witnesses, the predictions about Dobbs' aftermath and its potential impact on women's health have unfortunately, in many cases, all too many cases, come true. Women across our nation have lost the autonomy to make their own decisions about their body, their care, when and how to have a family. And the recent attack on fertility treatments proves that this issue may not stop at abortion. Contraception in different forms, IVF, IUDs, are on the front lines. Every woman in America deserves the freedom to make her own reproductive choices regardless of where she lives, and every American family should have the right to decide whether, when, to become a parent. Ms. Rivera, it's good to see you again. As President Biden said during his State of the Union, we've seen an assault on reproductive freedom. Fortunately, the administration's taken action to protect reproductive care through litigation challenging some of the state bans and executive orders. The administration has prioritized patient privacy protections and expanding access to contraception. What additional actions should the federal government consider to protect women in states with significant barriers to reproductive care? And what rights and protections might be at risk under a future administration that doesn't share the same commitment to protecting access to reproductive care?
Thank you, Senator. I think one of the things that can be done is passing the Omnibus Act, which is to address maternal health care, particularly for Black women who are facing maternal mortality, at disproportionate rates. The other one is making sure that states are actually expanding Medicaid so that people can get the health care they need. One of the alarming things that we're seeing right now is, the attacks on mifepristone. And I just want to say that mifepristone right now and medication abortion right now is what's keeping America from looking like pre-Roe America, where our emergency rooms were filled with women who had to resort to unsafe abortion. But right now they're able to access safe abortion. But mifepristone is being attacked right now in a current Supreme Court case. So that's one thing. And I think that investing, I think there should be a better time and resources spent investing in expanding access to services, expanding access to prenatal care, to substance use treatment for pregnant women, because there's a dearth of it right now. And this is the number one thing that I think can help us result in much better reproductive health outcomes.
Thank you. I think all of us who support healthy families and healthy children should support the legislation, the expansion of access to care that you referenced. But one of the issues that's been batted around quite a bit in today's hearing is the impact of the Alabama Supreme Court's decision in LePage versus Center for Reproductive Medicine, where they held that embryos are extrauterine children.
Yes.
The Alabama legislature says their new law protects fully access to IVF in their state. Is that true? Is the Alabama statute sufficiently comprehensive?
There are a lot of questions remaining. This legislative fix, I think at best, is temporary and narrow. So, for example, it talks about protecting patients from liability. Well, what happens when somebody's no longer a patient? So there's a big question there. And there's a big question about what happens when somebody else brings a challenge under the rationale of the state Supreme Court and under the state constitution. I really want to bring attention to the Chief Justice concurring opinion, which people should read because it's very alarming, just under religious freedom grounds. But the opinion basically says that the state legislature can do what it wants, but it has to comply with the state's constitutional language, which includes the Sanctity of Life Act. So that's a really big concern. And there's a parallel with the Life at Conception Act, which Congress is considering right now, which can make nationally look like Alabama.
Thank you, Ms. Hurd. If I might briefly, thank you for sharing how this Supreme Court decision in Alabama on fetal personhood affected you and your family. I joined my colleagues, Senators Duckworth, Murray, others, in introducing and supporting a bill to protect IVF nationwide. It was blocked on the floor. What would it mean for you personally and for families across our nation if Congress were to pass a law actually protecting access to IVF treatment across our country?
Thank you, Senator, for asking. It would mean everything. It would make me and my husband feel very much supported by this great state that we live in, great country that we live in. There are so many like myself that are experiencing infertility, and IVF is the only way that we can expand our family. So if we can get something passed that protects our access to that, it would absolutely mean a lot.
Thank you. Thank you to all our witnesses today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are witnessing today an act of political misdirection by the Democrats on this committee. I'm going to start with 3 propositions that are indisputably true and should be unassailable. Proposition number 1, the question of abortion is a question that is hotly contested in this country. Reasonable people of good conscience and good morals can disagree on the question, and they do, in every state in the Union. There are sharp, passionate, emotional, personal disagreements on this issue that people rightly care very deeply about. That's precisely why the U.S. Supreme Court in Dobbs said an issue like this that divides the American people should be decided by the American people. It should not be 9 unelected judges decreeing the rules for everyone to obey, but rather the voters should make those determinations. My Democrat colleagues are fond of beating their breast and saying we must defend democracy, except when the voters vote for things they dislike. As long as the voters cooperate and vote for a left-wing Democrat agenda, they like democracy in that instance. If they ever vote for anything to the contrary, few things horrify my Democrat colleagues more than actual democracy. What is the state of law in America right now? Each state determines what the rules are that shall govern abortion. And the rules that they adopt reflect the values and mores of those citizens. We would expect the people of Texas to adopt different rules than the people of California. That is perfectly okay, and that is the beauty of our federalist system that welcomes diversity. But here's the second proposition that is equally unassailable. The position of today's elected Democrats in Congress on abortion is wildly out of step with the American people. It is a radical proposition. Every Democrat in the Senate, every single one, has voted for legislation that would strike down every single common sense restriction on abortion adopted by every state in America. The position of the Democrats is they would strike down every law, they would legalize abortion up until the very moment of birth. They would legalize partial birth abortion. They would strike down every law providing for parental notification or parental consent. If your daughter gets a tattoo or a piercing, a mom or dad has a right to know about that, but the Democrats would strike down a law that entitles the parents to know before an abortion is given to their daughter. The position of the Democrats is not a mainstream position. Indeed, national polling shows roughly 9% of Americans agree with that position. 91% of Americans disagree with the position of every single elected Democrat in this body. And understand, I'm not ascribing that view to them. They have voted for legislation that would strike down those common sense restrictions. And that leads to the third proposition that is indisputable. IVF is fully protected in law. It should be fully protected in law, and it will remain 100% fully protected in law. Every Democrat knows that. Out of 100 senators in this body support IVF treatments. I strongly support IVF treatments. In fact, in the state of Texas, IVF treatments are protected in law, and in fact, since 1987, Texas has mandated IVF coverage for many group health insurance plans. The Democrats know this. There's a lot of focus on the Alabama Supreme Court decision. The Alabama Supreme Court decision was not a decision striking down IVF. In fact, it was a case brought by parents seeking IVF against a clinic that had negligently cared for the embryos. It was a decision in defense of preserving IVF. But a whole lot of partisan elected officials and a whole lot of partisans in the media immediately seized on that decision to say, aha, IVF will be struck down. Well, I will say the state of Alabama acted promptly. Bright red, ruby red Alabama acted promptly to say, no, IVF is protected. Right now, today, roughly 2% of live births are brought into the world through IVF. IVF is a wonderful gift that lets parents who want to welcome a son or daughter, a child to love, lets them welcome that child into the world. But understand why we're having a hearing on IVF, not because there is any threat to IVF, but because the Democrats cannot defend their position on abortion. They have not convened a hearing on whether the country should adopt the Democrat position and allow partial birth abortion in all 50 states. That is their position, but it's wildly unpopular. So for any mom or dad at home looking to have a child through IVF, understand IVF is 100% protected in law. It should be. It will be. I strongly support it, and so does every other member of this body.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Senator Durbin. I think I'm going to ask some experts questions here. Ms. Rivera, in June, the Supreme Court shredded nearly 5 decades of precedent, protecting June of 22, protecting a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. What has happened? Governors raced to the state capitals in certain states to pass laws that completely restricted a woman's right to make her own decisions, leaving it to politicians. Now 21 states. We have seen bans, partial bans, you name it. Can you talk about the chaos and cruelty the Dobbs decision has unleashed?
Thank you, Senator. We are experiencing an American dystopia with abortion bans preventing people from getting access to care as early as they need it where they live. And so for those who can, they have to travel hundreds of miles, and there are many people who can't. So they're not getting access. Women's and pregnant people's obstetric crises are not getting the standard of care because doctors fear getting arrested and going to jail, like in Texas for 100 years. This is the kind of landscape. The backdrop of this is the U.S.'s maternal mortality rate that exceeds that of other industrialized nations. And criminalization contributes to that disparity, contributes to poor maternal and infant health outcomes.
Thank you for bringing up some of these other problems that have been spawned by this. I would say one of them is the fact that we're starting to see less people going into OBGYN. Ms. Dennard, as both a last year number of OBGYN medical students applying to residencies in states with abortion bans dropped by over 10%. Dr. Dennard, as both a practicing OBGYN and a woman who sought abortion care in a state with strict abortion laws, how do you think these restrictions harm both patients and providers?
Thank you for that question. I love Texas. My family's there. I love practicing medicine, but it is becoming so difficult to do so in my state. There are, as you said, residents who are choosing to move, medical students who are choosing not to match to programs in my state, and it's causing incredible health crisis for pregnant people. I'd like to also comment on what Dr. Wubbenhorst had said previously. She mentioned how dangerous abortion is. Abortion is not dangerous. Abortion is safe, and abortion is essential health care. What is really dangerous is pregnancy, and especially pregnancy without access to abortion care. Medical situations are complicated. There is an art to practicing medicine. This is not a black or white issue. It's not a yes or no answer. We need to be able to take care of women in each and individual situation.
Okay. Ms. Rivera, on Tuesday, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in the Texas medication abortion case. As you know, this is about mifepristone. We know that this drug is safe. American Medical Association has stated that there is, quote, there is no evidence that people are harmed by having access to this safe and effective medication. It's been on the market for more than 2 decades. In 2023, it accounted for 63% of all abortions in the U.S. It's been approved in dozens and dozens of countries. How would a decision whereby justices on the Supreme Court second-guess scientists and experts at the FDA impact women throughout the United States? And really, how has the Texas decision already impacted them?
Thank you, Senator. Well, luckily, the Supreme Court has maintained the status quo until the case is heard or decided. It would have a devastating impact on access to care, quality of care, and reproductive health outcomes if medication abortion is scaled back, which is what this case could result in, even in states where abortion is accessible and legal. So this basically would have national impact on abortion care as well as the reproductive health status of pregnant people.
Just a last question to respond to some of what Senator Cruz has said. We'd be here for quite a while if you were to respond to all of it. But could you respond to the fact that, in fact, the Alabama Supreme Court did cite the Dobbs decision and that cases like this in other areas have been unleashed since that decision came out from the U.S. Supreme Court?
Absolutely. So while the Dobbs decision its holding did not rely on fetal personhood, but it basically opened the door and invited states to define embryos, fetuses, and fertilized eggs as persons if they so choose. And so Alabama cited to the Dobbs decision in redefining child to include a frozen embryo. And so I think this is the tip of the iceberg. There are 11 states with broad fetal personhood laws that have yet to be interpreted. And so I think this is the tip of the iceberg. And the legislation that Alabama adopted, as I said, it could be temporary, and it's very narrow, and it may not survive the next challenge when somebody takes it up to the state Supreme Court again.
Thank you, and I think it's one of the reasons so many of us are devoted to codified Roe v. Wade into law, which of course does allow for restrictions, as the case had in the 3rd trimester, as long as the women's health and life is protected. So that, again, responding to something Senator Cruz said. But it's very, very important that we do this for our nation and not have a patchwork of laws across our country for IVF, for mifepristone, or any of the issues we've discussed here today. And that's my last question. Just one answer. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and there's been a lot of mischaracterization today about the Women's Health Protection Act.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. When I first introduced the Women's Health Protection Act, now about 12 years ago, we never thought we would be here. We never thought that Roe v. Wade would be overturned. We never thought that IVF would be under threat. We never thought that speeches would be made like Senator Cruz telling us that everything's okay with IVF. No reason to worry because the state of Texas protects IVF. Well, here we are. Dobbs has overturned Roe v. Wade, and for reasons that you've just described so forcefully, Dobbs has opened the door to a panoply of evils. It has unleashed from that Pandora's box a collection of threats to women's reproductive rights. I would like you to comment on why those kinds of state laws that Senator Cruz referred to, whether it's Texas or elsewhere, fertility treatment protection laws and the Alabama statute that you mentioned, are really inadequate to protect those rights, building on the question that Senator Klobuchar just asked you?
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. I think we have to step back and look at the bigger picture here. The overarching goal here is to establish fetal personhood under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. I think that is the real danger. And all of these laws that recognize legal rights for embryos and fetuses and fertilized eggs in state law are paving the path to that. And all of these services are in danger because if you believe a fertilized egg is legally a person with all the same rights as everybody here in this room, that it endangers IVF, contraception, and any medical care that would, quote unquote, endanger that fertilized egg, embryo, or fetus, including people who are begging to have their humanity, their healthcare needs met, and saving their bodily organs and lives in emergency rooms because their health is deteriorating. The other case being considered by the Supreme Court is the EMTALA challenge, which the federal EMTALA statute is meant to prevent people's health from deteriorating. But what Idaho is arguing that their state law should override EMTALA until somebody's health has deteriorated to be staring death in the face before they can get access to health care.
And the Women's Health Protection Act would provide a guarantee of rights against those state laws, personhood laws, restrictions on clinics and whatever other kinds of inadequate conditions are placed on the exercise of these rights, reproductive health rights, would it not?
Yes, and I also want to correct some mischaracterizations about the Women's Health Protection Act. What the Women's Health Protection Act would do would establish a national floor for access, because what had been happening for over years and years are layers upon layers upon layers of restrictions to shut down abortion clinics and abortion health providers. So the Women's Health Protection Act would restore that access.
And there's nothing about the Women's Health Protection Act that requires anybody to be in favor of abortion or seek an abortion, correct?
Absolutely not.
And there's nothing in it that requires someone to engage in IVF?
Absolutely not. The point is that individuals should be able to make their own reproductive health care decisions.
Dr. Dennard, you said, I think, that what's dangerous is not pregnancy, but the lack of access to abortion, where a woman chooses to have it. And I guess the way I put it is, what's really dangerous is lack of access to health care, because abortion is a form of health care. And I think that when we recognize that reproductive rights are women's rights, are human rights, are health care rights, we have a frame to protect these rights from the kinds of deceptive and misleading attacks on them. Would you agree?
Absolutely, I would agree with what you're saying.
Thank you.
I've been pregnant 6 times, and I have 3 children. That is because the road to becoming a parent is not always straightforward. Every person's journey to becoming a parent is different. There are lots of twists and turns. I've had abortions, I've had miscarriages, and I have 3 healthy children. And in order to have those 3 healthy children, I needed access to, as you describe, basic medical care. And that's what my patients need. That's what I need to be able to provide them good care.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. one of the reasons that I was very much awakened to politics as a way to support social changes was on the issue of abortion. I was in college when the state legislature in Hawaii took up the issue of abortion rights, and in fact, the state of Hawaii was the first state to decriminalize abortion before Roe v. Wade. This is an issue that is very fundamental. What could be more fundamental than a person's right to control her own body and to make decisions relating to her body? What could be more invasive than to force us to have babies? I can't think of a single thing that we do basically to men that is as invasive as a bunch of politicians saying to a male person, you have to do this. I can't think of an instance, and yet something as invasive and fundamental as a woman's right to control her own body is under assault. So here comes Dobbs. I never thought I'd live to see the day when we have a Supreme Court majority that just summarily decides that something that I had taken as a constitutional right for almost 50 years, a constitutional right, where they just say, well, it's no longer a constitutional right. What kind of Supreme Court is that if they, the ultimate arbiters of what is constitutional and not constitutional, decides that this right that I had for almost 50 years no longer exists, and you leave it to the politicians in each state to make that decision? I have no words to express what an assault this is on women in our country, to force us to have babies. And now, even for the women who want to have babies, IVF is under assault. So I say, if you don't support abortion, don't get one, but leave the rest of us alone. There are good-hearted people, fair-minded people on both sides of the abortion issue. I acknowledge that. And that is why it should never be a decision that is left up to a bunch of politicians. It's a decision that is so personal and so fundamental that it should be left to the person, individual, and her doctor, if she so chooses. So the ripple effects of Dobbs, never ending. And we know that already people are making decisions as to what states they're going to live in, because if they live in one of the many states that criminalize abortion, they have to travel out of state to get the kind of reproductive health care that they need. And not all women or not all families have that capability. So once again, like the so-called right to abortion, if you were a poor person and lived in a state that did not provide funding for Medicaid abortions, you're pretty much out of luck. Hawaii was one of the few states that paid for Medicaid abortions, because what is a constitutional right if that right to be exercised depended on your economic situation? So we now have the circumstance where after Dobbs, individuals have to travel out of state to get the abortion care and other reproductive care that they need. And don't tell me that IVF is legal everywhere. If so, why did Alabama have to pass a law that so-called legalizes IVF in that state? And even that is not protective enough, because if I were a clinic providing IVF care, I would definitely not want to take the chance that that Alabama law is going to protect me, just as in Texas, their law protects the right that if the health care, if the life of a woman is endangered, she can get an abortion. Oh, really? I don't think that's the case, because what doctors, what providers are going to take the chance that maybe they did not determine that correctly, and that they have to wait till the woman is practically on death's door in order to deem the protection of her life to be one that would enable her to get an abortion. So, you know, the Dobbs decision has had so much negative effects. Mifepristone, oh yes, we have a Supreme Court that is about to determine whether or not a medication that more than half of people resort to legally in order to have an abortion, that could very well be banned, because we have a Supreme Court that seems perfectly willing to just eliminate what was deemed a 50-year constitutional right. So I come down to who's going to make the decision on whether or not a woman has a right to make reproductive decisions, bodily autonomy. Is it the woman, or should it be a bunch of us or state legislators? It is so clear to me who should have that decision-making. And all of these bills, all of these efforts, and all of these ways and really to say that that this is an issue that good-hearted, right-minded people have very, they come to different conclusions, and I say that's right. And that is why we should have bodily autonomy. If you don't support abortion, don't get one. Leave the rest of us alone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rivera, Dobbs has really created this patchwork of laws all across the country that make it very difficult for people to access what is really important in terms of their health care. But on IVF in particular, it's created real challenges on sort of this patchwork on affecting women depending on where they live. Can you discuss that for a minute for me and let me know more specifically what's that doing to the profession as a whole?
Thank you, Senator. I think, the Alabama situation is the tip of the iceberg, and we'll have to see how the rest of it plays out. There are these 11 states with very broad fetal personhood laws. They haven't yet been fully enforced. So we'll have to see what challenges are brought, what those state Supreme Courts decide. But that's the point. Senator Hirono has a point, right? What's happening is that it's been kind of left to the states to decide. Women's fundamental freedoms are being left to be decided state by state.
And so let me just drill in for this for a second, because many people don't realize that this insecurity or uncertainty is affecting women's access to reproductive care.
Yes.
And so let's be very specific. Are there, yes or no, doctors, OBGYNs, leaving certain states to go to other states, leaving these holes in the kind of care that individuals can get, that women can get in their communities?
Yes, one of the impact in the post-Dobbs environment is that there are OBGYNs that are leaving states in areas that are already extremely underserved. So there are increasing OBGYN deserts that's happening.
And are those in wealthy communities? What do those communities look like that these deserts exist?
It is, the disproportionate impact is in communities of color. Let's be very clear. In rural areas, in communities of color who already have trouble accessing appropriate reproductive health care. So, and this, all of this, we're going to have to watch the maternal mortality rate very carefully and who it's going to be impacting, because I think it's going to be increasing over time. It already is increasing. And for the first time in 2021, Latinas had higher maternal mortality rates than white women.
And so let's just, jump into the outrage of this. Mm-hmm. The United States of America has one of the highest maternal mortality rates writ large of other industrial nations, correct?
That is correct.
And that's for the whole country. But when you start looking at it by race, you see for African American women that there is almost a 4 times higher maternal mortality rate. And what you're saying right now, that these laws that are creating this patchwork are further exacerbating the access to maternal health care of African American women and low-income women.
That is correct, and I'll say 2 more things. One is that there's a big overlap in the worst maternal mortality and infant mortality rates with abortion ban states. And secondly, that criminalization of pregnancy contributes to these poor health outcomes because it deters people from accessing care.
And so Black women who are most at risk in dying at childbirth, Black women who are most at risk for having low birth weight babies, Black women who are most likely to have fetal deaths in giving birth, are now being put in a situation where their lives are greater at risk, where their babies are at greater risk, where their long-term health care is at greater risk because of all of these laws that are being passed that are restricting access to not just maternal care, but even to OBGYNs in the first place?
Let me put it this way. Black women in this country are the ones most likely to be staring death in the face because during pregnancy. And so it is so important and critical for them to be able and be in the driver's seat to be making their own reproductive health care decisions.
And this is the last point. The outrage is that a lot of these laws, the women that are both most being scrutinized over miscarriages, the women that are being most scrutinized over the idea that their lives are threatened because of their pregnancy, you see disproportionately, is it true or not, that these are African-American women and low-income women?
So on the criminalization of pregnancy, Black women are certainly overrepresented in the number of people who are being charged with crimes. But the biggest impact, we actually have more poor white women who are being charged and arrested for supposed harm to fetuses. So this is also a situation of poverty, right? Of who is poor and who is a person of color.
So people of color, low-income women, poor women
Yes.
are facing the brunt of these laws that are often ending up putting their lives, their health, and their well-being greater at risk, and also putting them at greater risk for low birth weight babies, fetal deaths, as well as maternal mortality.
That is correct, and also being criminalized and put in prison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have at least one question I'd like to get to, but first thing I want to do is associate myself with Senator Booker's comments, line of questioning on the equity, racial and otherwise, element of this important conversation. And second, Mr. Chairman, I can't help but feel the need to respond to some of the comments I heard earlier from Republican members of this committee. So let me clarify that, first of all, Democrats are not trying to deflect here. We're not trying to mislead here. We're trying to stand up for what's right and what stood as a right for half a century in the United States of America. And we're not afraid of democracy. You want to hear who's afraid of democracy? Those who were more than just disappointed by outcomes of elections in a number of states. Folks, this question has been on the ballot since the Dobbs decision. Questions put before voters whether or not to make access to reproductive health care more restricted or to strengthen access. And in state after state, the public has sided with more access. Not just in the state of California, which is considered, it's a deep blue state. I'm talking states like Virginia and Michigan, very purple states by some people's measure, but also states like Missouri, Ohio, Kentucky. So no, we're not afraid of democracy, but we do believe that there are some issues that rise to the level that warrant national, federal protections. It would be wrong to suggest that there shouldn't be any for the whole country and just let each state do what they want. Now, I do believe there's some of our colleagues who would like to leave the question of things like marriage equality to the states, and we shouldn't have federal protections. We should, and we do. I'm sure there's some of my colleagues who would rather return the question of interracial marriage to the states, and we shouldn't have federal protections. We should, and we do. So I'm sure there's some of my colleagues who think there shouldn't be federal protections for our fundamental right to vote. We should, and we kind of do. That's some unfinished business, but that may be a topic for a hearing on another day. And the question of Alabama. No, the way we have portrayed the decision by the Alabama Supreme Court relative to IVF is actually right on point. It's why former President Trump has tried so quickly to distance himself from that decision. And when Republicans called on the Alabama legislature to respond to it. When my colleague on this committee says, well, you're wrong, but it should be fixed and it will be fixed. You can't have it both ways. It was right or it's wrong. Clearly, the Alabama Supreme Court got it wrong, and the Alabama legislature was put in the position of having to rectify. Now to today's hearing. Since the decision by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, thousands of women have been forced to travel outside of their home state, sometimes hundreds of miles, to access the reproductive health care that they need. California is among several states that has seen a significant rise in out-of-state women seeking essential care. And it's more critical now than ever that all women are able to freely travel to access the reproductive health care that they need. It's equally important to ensure that states like California also are supported with the adequate resources to provide women with that quality care regardless of where they come from. Ms. Rivera, we keep turning to you for your tremendous perspective and expertise here. How has the influx of out-of-state women seeking care impacted healthcare systems in states like California where abortion remains legal?
Thank you for your question, Senator. So states like California, a number of states have really stepped up and expanded access to abortion care because of the anticipation that more people will need it, which is great. On the other hand, it strained those systems in the state. So people inside those states have longer waiting periods, for example, because it's harder to get an appointment because of the influx of people from other states. So on one hand, it is great that states like California are able to serve people coming from out of states, and at the same time, it really is taxing the health system in your state.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Padilla. Senator Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses. Just a comment about this decision by the Supreme Court in Dobbs, which I think was profoundly cynical, based on, quote, originalism, and that's in the mind of the Supreme Court justices who wanted to overturn what had been settled doctrine. And the second thing that's so disturbing about this, and I'm sorry Senator Cruz isn't here, the idea that the privacy rights that were enshrined in Roe v. Wade, that value that we placed constitutionally on certain realms of decision-making that belong to the individual person is challenged and then is turned over to a political process. Senator Rono said it best. You make your own decision. You respect the decision another person makes because that's her right. That's all upside down now. And it's unleashed this whirlwind where states are having bans from the moment of conception, where personhood where IVF is threatened, where every right that we've had is thrown into turmoil. And it's all on the basis of the Supreme Court rejecting the notion that there are certain spheres where it is the individual who has the freedom to make the decision that is best for her and not impose her decision on others. And we're reaping the whirlwind. And I just want to express to you, Ms. Hurd, thank you so much for coming in. I can't believe what you went through. And you and your husband in the effort to create a family. And my apologies to you that your court has done to you what it did. I do want to ask a question just on a practical level about what's the implication and the cost to a family who wants to have IVF. Ms. Rivera, could you talk about that? What's the implication here about an already expensive procedure? What's it going to cost a family like the Hurd family if they want to do this?
I am not an expert on this, Senator Welch, but I can tell you that anything that makes it harder for an already emotionally and physically taxing process where people have out-of-pocket costs depending on insurance coverage, for example. Timing is everything from what I understand with IVF, and anything that makes it more difficult just creates enormous barriers.
Okay. And Doctor, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of the questions that Senator Cruz was asking about late-term abortion. And my understanding is that late-term abortions are very rare, and it's almost always, really probably always, where there's a medical emergency and the life of the woman is imperiled. And I'm not, if we as a U.S. Senate try to figure out what should be done in that moment in circumstances that we know nothing about, that's going to jeopardize, in my view, very much the life of the mother. Can you speak about the agony of the decision that has to be made and what the considerations are?
Of course, and thank you for that question. Like I've said before, medicine is not black and white. It's not straightforward. And abortion access and the ability for an individual to receive an abortion is basic health care and medical care. I invite you, Senator Welch or Senator Cruz, if he wants to come back, to follow me around in the hospital and really see what it's like to take care of patients and to see what it could potentially be like to try to have an exception for a patient who's critically ill, what that really looks like, because I haven't seen it work yet. I've seen patients on mechanical ventilation, patients who have active cancer, patients who are extremely ill. None of them have received abortions. They've remained pregnant. So the whole idea of, I don't even know what a late-term abortion is, to be quite honest. The vast majority of abortions occur in the first trimester, but that's not really the point. The point is that it needs to be a decision for an individual after shared decision-making and good counseling by a provider so that they can make the best decision for themselves.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
I want to thank the panel. I have two things I'd like to raise, and you've been very patient to this point. But going back to Senator Cruz's statements, I listened to him, and then I read some information given to me by my staff. What are the reasons for really late-term abortions? Well, there are three. And the information I'm reading from comes from the Center for Disease Control. Why women need access to abortion late in pregnancy: maternal health endangerment, diagnosis of severe fetal abnormality, which didn't show up or develop until late into pregnancy, restrictive state laws that made it difficult for a woman to get an abortion early in her pregnancy. And we're talking about 1% of all abortions. I do politics for a living. So if you want to make your case, you make it in the extreme. The day before she gave birth, should she get an abortion then because she didn't like the gender of the baby that's going to be born? That was one of the examples that was used by one of the senators here. And you think to yourself, does that really happen? Could it happen? Well, it might in the extreme case, in the exceptional case. What they're really getting to is they don't trust the woman to make the decision. Implicit in that statement is the notion they're going to get it wrong or they're going to do something stupid and this innocent baby that might have been born is not going to be born. It hardly ever happens, and the reasons are set out by the CDC in extreme cases. And I trust women a lot more than I trust the politicians of Alabama or even Illinois to make that same decision for that woman. I think that's what the bottom line is as far as the late term's concerned. And the other thing, you look at the bills that many of my Republican colleagues have on the subject of abortion, and many of them have exceptions for IVF. They say so when they come to the committee hearing. We're not arguing about IVF. We have difference of opinion on abortion. Here's the fundamental problem I see. If you believe that life begins at the moment of conception, if that is your premise for your policy and your law, how are you going to explain IVF? Because at the end of the day, there are going to be embryos that are not implanted, and something has to happen to them. And if they're treated as humans, persons, whatever you characterize them, as they worried about in Alabama, you're drawn to one conclusion. If you think that life begins at the moment of conception, you have to do something to protect that embryo. But I have to tell you, I don't believe that. I don't believe that is the premise that we should start off on, because it takes us to a place that is impossible to live with, as far as I'm concerned, with the extraordinary circumstances that face many people. I hope that there will be some people, as a result of this hearing, who will think a little bit more on the subject. I will certainly think a little bit more. We had an excellent turnout by the committee because the issue is not only topical, but it's real and it's human, and we all know somebody like Ms. Hurd whose life has been positively impacted by IVF. Thank you so much for bringing your experience to it, and thanks to all the witnesses. The hearing will remain open for 1 week for submission of additional materials for the record, and with that, the hearing is adjourned.